The next time the abuser tells you that the reason he is abusive towards you is something you have done, remind yourself that no one is ever responsible for another person's actions. The next time the abuser tells you that he wouldn't get so angry with you if you would just try harder, remind yourself of how hard you've been trying and how little effect your efforts have had on his actions. And most important, the next time you are lying in bed crying over something the abuser has said or done, remind yourself of who you were before you met him. Source unknown. This is Behind the News Long Island. It's time.
Check. Hey yo, it's time. Hey yo, it's time. It's time. Hey yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming to bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong animated gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Beat our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow expose flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news, where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through. And that's word that serves. The time is now. For the youth in our roots, gotta stand our ground. Listen Tuesdays at 5. Tune in to 99.5 East Ways. Reporting live behind the news. Radio will break from the norm as we advocate for change and reform. Behind the news, unifying while exposing the counterfeits. It's the new voice of empowerment. Behind the new platform for the people it serves, where the truth in your speakers emerge. Behind the new, where politics meet their limitations, you get the real, never imitation. Behind the news, it's time, Sways. It's time, it's time. Long Island, what up?
All right, buenas noches, familia. Good evening, family. Welcome to WBAI's Behind the News Long Island. Tonight, we continue with our Her Story Month celebration. I am your host, Sergio Argueta, Serge, and I'm joined in studio by our regular cast. Brother Reggie Johnson is engineering tonight's show, and my brother Antonio Kelly's in the studio with the cameras. We're recording tonight's show, so you can find it on the internet. We'll get you that website a little bit later. Tonight, we're discussing violence against women. It's an epidemic. We're learning the realities, and most importantly, we're asking ourselves, what could we do to help eradicate it, or at the very least, doing all we can to reduce it. Please don't forget that Behind the News Long Island airs every Tuesday. We're asking you to follow us on Facebook via Behind the News LI. You could also follow me at Strong Surge on Twitter, FB, and Instagram. That's STRONG, I've been getting a lot of positive feedback and suggestions. Trust that we're hearing
Welcome back to Behind the News Long Island. That is a song titled Behind the Wall by Tracy Chapman. And I think in terms of researching something that we can open up tonight's show with, this really was a powerful piece that I felt needed to be played. Tonight we're talking about an issue that impacts more than 4 million women. These women experience physical assault and rape by their partners as a result of domestic violence, violence against women. 1 in 3 female homicide victims are murdered by their current or former partner every year. Domestic violence costs more than $37 billion a year in law enforcement involvement, legal work, medical and mental health treatment, and lost productivity of companies. With these staggering numbers, I'm sure that anyone and everyone knows at least one person now or in our past that has been a victim of domestic violence. These women, mostly women, we'll talk about that, are our grandmothers, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts. They're our daughters and our granddaughters. Tonight, I'm joined by 2 outstanding colleagues, individuals that I've encountered throughout the last 15 years, and their paths have crisscrossed as well. They're the unsung heroes and sheroes that are out there every day helping improve the lives of others, and so I'm very fortunate. First, I'd like to introduce Gaby Castillo, who's an immigration staff attorney with an organization named SEPA Mujer out in Long Island. SEPA Mujer aims to highlight the value of Latina immigrant women in our community and to highlight and develop their important roles on Long Island. Prior to that, she was a staff attorney in the immigrant justice program with legal services out in Charlotte, North Carolina. She's represented and worked extensively with survivors in domestic violence and or sexual assaults and obtaining immigration benefits under the Violence Against Women Act and UT visas. We also have with us a good friend and colleague, Anthony Zenkus, who's the Director of Education for the Safe Center. He's worked and speaks on a number of issues, including youth and families, family violence, sexual assault, and trauma. He's trained thousands of professionals throughout our region, and he's provided counseling for children, teens, and families that have dealt with these numerous challenges. Anthony is also an adjunct faculty member at Adelphi University. Thank you both for joining me on this evening, and our listeners of Behind the News Long Island, and we appreciate you trekking it out from Long Island.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here.
Okay. Well, listen, so, let's talk about it. What is it? Why is it that, we don't really talk about this issue when people think domestic violence? I'm going to send this first question out to you, Anthony. What is domestic violence? How do we explain it? How do we describe it? How do we get others to understand what it is?
Domestic violence really falls under the umbrella of domestic abuse. It's not one incident. It's a pattern of behavior where one partner exercises power and control over another partner. And often they control many aspects of that victim's life. So there can be physical violence. One in four women will be victims of intimate partner physical violence in their lives, but far more are victims of this more broader type of abuse where their finances are controlled, they're socially isolated, verbally threatened, their self-concept is degraded, their movements are controlled, they're often stalked. They don't have access to the things that we all take for granted that make us independent adults. And it's not a one-time thing. This pattern of behavior is something they go home to or live with every single day of their lives.
And so are we saying that, there has to be a pattern? Are we saying that someone who's in a relationship and, physical abuse has only happened once? Or we come up with a number of different excuses. He loves me and, he's just making sure I'm okay. That's why I can't hang out with my guy friends anymore because they may take advantage. Can you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, rarely does anything happen just once when there's domestic abuse happening. And if you look at, if there was one physical incident, there probably was a lot of emotional control and abuse happening leading up to it. And so, but we tend to think the best in others, especially those we choose to be in relationships with. Nobody wants to think that person is there to harm them. So, often offenders are very manipulative. It comes out slowly. It trickles out. If somebody socks you in the jaw the first time you go on a date with them, you're probably not going to see them again. And this is very subtle. And I think you hit on something important, too, because they'll say, sometimes people think, well, he's paying attention and he just is concerned about who I'm hanging out with and he doesn't want me to talk to my ex-boyfriend because he really loves me. It starts subtly. And sadly, it doesn't stay at that stage. And like you said, sometimes the end result is severe physical or mental abuse to the point of, a third of the women killed in the United States are murdered by their intimate partners or former intimate partners.
And we've been bringing this up often. We're talking about Women's History Month. We're Her Story Month, right? We're talking about these different challenges and what impacts us. And, let's talk socialization. Because when we talk about the way we empower our young ladies or who we teach them to fear, we always, stranger danger is always at the top of the list. You got to be careful when you're walking. Don't go into the parking lot when it's dark. And yes, absolutely, we have to be careful. But what about that socialization piece, Gaby? What about, how is it, what are the underlying issues? How is it that our young ladies are given these messages? But, and right now we'll even get to that in terms of a couple of questions later. Our young women are disproportionately impacted most. How are they socialized? Why is it that this is accepted?
I think oftentimes we don't realize sometimes even as parents that the conversation really ought to start at the early stages, right, of childhood. Even talking about when we talk about healthy, unhealthy touching, we can also talk about healthy, unhealthy relationships. When our girls come to us or our little boys come to us and say, so and so hit me. We've mentioned this before, where it's they like you, and that's why they're hitting you. That's why they're bothering you. So I think the conversation needs to start at a much earlier age, and it needs to be a bit more candid. We need to be more open about it. I know, growing up, perhaps even in certain cultural households, that's not brought up. We don't discuss having a boyfriend. We don't discuss being in relationships. And even from a personal, experience in my household, immigrant parents, Latino immigrant parents, we never discussed relationships. And I think that that's something that perhaps we need to start doing at an earlier age. Let's not wait for that incident to happen to our children, because we also know that abuse can also happen in adolescent relationships, and we see it much more often now.
Much more prevalent now, particularly with social media. I know that that's something we've discussed as well. Anthony, we're starting to talk about the issue, and we're still broaching it. The numbers are staggering, and as a result, we know that families are deeply impacted. So when we hear 1 out of 4 women in a number of these households, there are children that are witnessing this on a regular basis, that are impacted by this. So we're not just talking about the immediate target, if you will, of this abuse. We're talking about, the others, the quote unquote collateral damage by way of parents that might be in a household witnessing their daughter being abused by a boyfriend and being afraid to step in. Or, what about the children? Can you speak to those, to that impact and the trauma that these children deal with?
Yeah, well, Sergio, the impact of domestic abuse is felt throughout the household and the ripple effects throughout the community. Kids who grow up, and sadly millions of kids right now are growing up in homes where there is domestic violence and abuse going on, they are profoundly affected by it. They're less likely to have a best friend. I mean, can you think about wanting to bring somebody home to a house that's a war zone? And so they're more likely to be isolated in school. Sometimes the kids are also targeted physically by the perpetrator. It's more than 30 or 40% are more likely to be physically abused as well. But, at the Safe Center in Nassau County where I work, we see a lot of crossover between domestic violence and sex abuse, where perpetrators of sex abuse are using domestic violence and abuse to keep that non-offending mother, usually, unable to really do what she needs to do to either leave or protect her children, because she's also being victimized. So they do victimize the whole family. And, the Centers for Disease Control did some studies some years back, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it documented how being exposed to this kind of trauma in childhood can affect a person throughout their lives. These kids are at great risk as they grow up. They're more likely, as children, to have conduct disorders, more likely to be depressed or use substances as teens, and then, sadly, more likely to get in relationships that are abusive themselves. But it doesn't stop there. It can affect their physical health. People with the most trauma in childhood are more likely to have all sorts of physical diseases, from cancer to diabetes to heart disease. So, being exposed to this stuff for months and years really affects at the core who we are. And that's why we try to help children growing up in that environment to be in a safer place, but also, to heal those emotional wounds.
That damage, what we're saying is that the damage is more than just physical, even mental. It's physiological. It gets to a point where the victims of this trauma can't even function, and you see it behaviorally. You see these signs that start off kind of early. When we talk about these different signs, Gaby, you work in a unique setting, right? You work for SEPA Mujer, really focusing the bulk of your work with Latina immigrant women, and you talked about a cultural perspective that exists within the Latino community where we don't talk about these issues. Right. But the threat in these situations is not just the physical violence. There's also, abusers are using things like immigration status Absolutely. Against these same folks. Can you talk about those challenges?
Sure. So, we see, I think any victim, survivor of domestic violence has pretty much gone through the same challenges, right? Has possibly gone through that cycle that we talk about, of leaving and, coming back because the abuser has sweet talked them or has promised it's never going to happen again. So yes, I think they encounter all the same challenges as any other domestic violence victim, but the immigrant victim has these additional hurdles, if you will, to cross also, which are, the language barriers, right? They are fairly new to this country, to their community. They often don't have any resources or don't know that any exist. Getting to court for them is an insurmountable challenge. They are afraid of their legal status. And if the abuser has status, himself or herself, they will absolutely use that as a form of manipulation. And some of the things that we hear is, you call the police, you're going to be the one that gets deported. Remember, I have legal status. Or if the police come, they're going to take away the children. There's no way they're going to give you custody. You don't have documentation here. I'm a U.S. citizen or I'm a permanent resident. I'll keep the children. And these are, the tactics that they'll use. And of course, they instill fear, in any mother wanting to remain with her children, or any parent for that matter, because we've had, male victims, at least in my experience, that have been also manipulated because of the legal status situation, at least. So it can happen, the victimization can happen as well to males in the immigrant community if the spouse is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident and can use that status against them.
And in those instances, clearly SEPA is working on assisting these folks, and I know that the Safe Center also is. Can you kind of talk about, in those situations, what you would do and say to someone in there?
Sure. So really, a lot of the work that we do is also the advocacy and the education, to bring resources to the community, to let them know, these are your rights as a victim. This is what you can do. These are your resources. We refer certainly people, to the Safe Center, to other agencies around Long Island that can assist them at least in the court process of obtaining that very important initial protection from the court, whether it's custody, orders of protection, and we educate them on that. But then also comes the need for stabilizing their immigration status. You're leaving this relationship, zero resources, often homeless. The person controlled the finances in the household. They were the ones that worked. So we represent them in their immigration cases under Violence Against Women's Act, which allows them to apply for immigration status based on that domestic violence. And there's two different forms they can go about that. One where if the person was, a victim of a crime that was reported to the authorities, where they cooperated with the authorities, and we get certification stating that, we apply for what's called a U visa. So this allows someone that's been the victim of domestic violence, in addition to other crimes in the regulations, to apply for this benefit regardless of the spouse's or perpetrator status. Then we have the VAWA self-petitions, which is really for victims of domestic violence who are married to their U.S. citizen or permanent resident spouse. So in a sense, it pretty much allows them to leave that situation, because another thing that the perpetrator uses is, I will not continue with that case if you leave. So you're never going to get any status. And, that's another form of a fear tactic for them. To say, my children are here, I run the risk of being deported. So this allows them to be able to leave a dangerous situation, to stabilize their immigration status, and to lead, a healthy life with their children, obtain employment, obtain housing. So it's kind of a way to help them get out of that situation.
Anthony, you alluded to the fact that domestic violence impacts the entire family, and oftentimes children are also the victims of this type of manipulation and violence. And I know countless kids that are in situations where their parents are abusive, and they do hold these things over them in terms of, I'm not, you're in the middle of an immigration proceeding, or we've just paid for your attorney and we will withdraw that counsel. So it's a twist, if you will. What do we say to individuals that are in this situation? What do we say to someone that has all these different concerns, whether they are economic, in terms of, we know that this is one of the reasons why women stay in abusive relationships, because they won't be able to fend for themselves and or their children. I also know that there was something done, I believe, earlier on in Long Island where they even talked about pets that were the pets in domestic violence situations, and there, even if a family got up and went into a shelter of some sort, they couldn't take pets. And so there's all these nuances, if you will, that the layman doesn't talk about.
Yeah, there's a lot of barriers to leaving, and that, and let's just say this for those that are listening, whenever they hear or come across a situation of domestic abuse and they ask the question, why doesn't she leave? We need to ask the question, why does he hit? Why does he abuse?
Absolutely.
Those are the wrong questions. Why doesn't she leave? And one of the reasons, too, by the way, you talk about domestic homicides, they're most likely to happen after somebody leaves. People know what they need to do for themselves and their family. But there are a lot of barriers to leaving. I'll address some of the ones that you brought up. The pets thing, really interesting, because Nassau County, within the past year, the ASPCA in Nassau has vowed that they would take any animal, whether it's a dog, a cat, a turtle, a horse, whatever you have. That's a barrier to leaving. If you need to go into a shelter for domestic abuse, domestic violence, they will house that animal safely until you're in a safe place. And why that's important is we've had families that haven't left their abuser because he's threatened. If you leave, I will kill the dog. Sadly, they do. The overlap between animal abuse and domestic abuse and family violence is very, very clear. So that's one barrier. The economic barrier is huge. Look, we live in a society, women don't make as much as men do for doing the same jobs. The majority of people in low-wage jobs are women. There's fast food workers making $8 an hour. They're women with families. And it is really hard in New York the poverty level is $23,500 for a family of four. Yeah. You can't live on twice that, if you're a single mom with a few kids. So it is very difficult. The barriers to leaving make it really hard for people to stand on their own 2 feet. But let's also not forget the fact that even when you have you seem like you have the financial means to leave, your family could be wealthy, and the abuser controls all those finances. And so here again is a situation where we've had women go to the ATM and their entire account was drained. They had no access to credit cards. They're not allowed. They don't have a credit history. So when you think about, well, how do I just up and leave? It's not easy. So we need other organizations that we work with to is it SEPTA? Yeah, to really collaborate on these cases, because it's these families need so much support.
Yeah, and really getting an individual to the point where they're even ready to take that step. It's quite the journey to even get to that point. Gabby, I know that there's some things you wanted to say.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to add, there's also this social stigma sometimes attached, to the victim leaving a marriage or relationship, whether it's family members or, the community at large of, well, now I'm going to be a single mother, and how is my family going to see this? And perhaps it is drawn on cultural lines there, but I know, at least in the Latino culture, there's this huge stigma of divorce, of leaving, and no one needs to know that that's what happened. We're not going to discuss that that's what, he was doing or she was doing to the family. So I think that's also another barrier sometimes for the person to leave.
Yeah, well, the stigma is real. The messaging that particularly our young ladies receive early on, like, oh, you have to get married and you have to stay married, and, you have to put up with certain things. And, and it's true in relationships, no one's going to get 100% of what they want, but they have to establish that middle ground. And Anthony makes the point of, we don't necessarily need to focus on just empowering our young ladies. We have to talk about those agents, right? Mm-hmm. It's the agents of the violence, not just the targets. And I think that's sort of where we've been focusing. It's already past the halfway point. We're gonna take a couple of minute a break for a couple of minutes, and we'll come right back and hear from our panelists. All right, you were just hearing the Ludacris and Mary J. Blige, Runaway Love. That was a song that really touched on a number of different issues that are impacting our young women. Today, we are talking about domestic violence, and I'm joined by two outstanding panelists. individuals that are doing some outstanding work on Long Island, working with victims of domestic violence. Miss Gaby Castillo, who's an immigration attorney over at SEPA Mujer, and Anthony Zenkus, who's doing a lot of work around this issue for the Safe Center. Right before the break, we talked about socialization, and we kind of talked about things that we need to do for our young ladies. But Anthony, here we are, two men talking about this issue of domestic violence. We're talking about the targets and the agents of violence, right? And clearly the agents are the ones that are really perpetrating most of this violence. And as men, what are some of your suggestions when it comes to socialization?
First thing we need to do is to name the issue. Domestic violence isn't a woman's issue, it's a men's issue. And granted, there are men who are victims of domestic abuse, absolutely, and we help them just as much as SEPA does. But, the vast majority of relationship violence in a heterosexual relationships, those are, that's violence and abuse perpetrated by men against women. So we need to have conversations starting very young with boys about what power really is, and what it means to love and respect somebody. That violence and control are not examples of love and respect. I mean, kids look to their parents for modeling, so that's why we intervene with these families to try to stop what's going on in the home if it's destructive. But I think this has to be a broader conversation. I think our communities need to talk about male aggression and why do we reward it, whether it's in sports or in other venues, and why do we celebrate it? We need to celebrate and reward different behaviors, peaceful, respectful behaviors, and that's not a one-time conversation. It's not a just say no to violence thing. It's a how do we build respectful, men that can interact with other men and women in positive, peaceful ways that build our families and our communities up. Those conversations need to happen broadly, whether it's in faith communities, in schools, in homes, and at the level of government as well. And I don't think they have. We've isolated this problem, and it needs to be looked at broader.
There's so many institutions that we need to hold accountable, if you will. And, you've alluded to some of them, Anthony. I mean, we had a program on politics, women in politics last week, and, only 20% of the legislatures across the state. And that's where it's the highest, right? Only 20% of these individuals that are legislating around these issues are females. The houses of worship. I mean, the times when we visited congregations and the leader of this particular house can actually get up there and say, women have to listen to the man, and the man is this, and you have to, these are messages that we're constantly receiving, and no one ever wants to be that person that gave up on a marriage for a number of different reasons or gave up on a relationship. But what Anthony's now saying is we need to talk to the males. Gaby, I'm thinking Latino culture, male culture in general, right? And the way we've all been socialized, and this idea that our social identity is shaped by our gender, and the way from very early on, from before the baby leaves the womb, we're talking to them in a particular way, and they're receiving this messaging, right? What do you think we need to do to reach, these different boys in trying to inculcate this sense of responsibility and this sense of caring, not only for women, right, but for other males as well?
I think number one, and I think across the board, even in immigrant communities and in the general community, is remove the double standards that we're constantly dealing with when it comes to males and females. I mean, and even in our country, when we're still, fighting, when we have our government telling women what to do with their bodies still, in this day of age, it's a constant battle. It's a constant battle for our rights, for gender equality. We're fighting the lines on, equal wages, employment opportunities. So I think it's to remove that double standard coming from outside influences when we're talking about even our government, what they, have on women, the inequalities that we're still fighting today, and also in the home, and again, you brought up Latino culture specifically. We are taught of, the boys can do this because they're boys. We're not going to talk to the girls about sex. You don't need to know about that. but we're going to encourage the boys. And at least, again, speaking from even from experience, we're not gonna talk to girls about the relationships. You don't need to worry about boyfriends. You don't need to worry about any of that. So I think it definitely is removing that double standard. And including boys, such as Anthony said, when we talk about these issues of domestic violence, when we talk about, violence in general, when we talk about sexual assaults, don't just gear it toward females as the audience. We know that this happens. I mean, males are victimized as well, so let's treat them also in that sense that, yes, you can be a victim of this as well, but also to bring in males to say, this is what appropriate relationships or healthy relationships are like, and this is how we should have discussions with our partners and vice versa. So I think it's absolutely removing those standards.
Gabby, I couldn't agree more. I think also we really have to underline the point of power in our society and the way power is distributed. Male privilege is a real thing, and like many things, you don't often know you have it till somebody else points it out. Yep. And
even then there's denial.
Oh, absolutely. Denial, it's not just the river in Egypt. It's but we know that boys, and let's look at, athletics can be such an amazing thing for young women and young men growing up. Gives them confidence, builds them up physically. It's a great thing. But we also know that, in schools that are very heavily focused on boys in athletics, that athletic privilege, when they grow up, they're more likely to commit campus sexual assaults in college, because we've created a culture that distributes power in a way that's destructive to young women and girls, and we've excused the behavior of boys, and that keeps happening, and it happens when they grow older. And even at the highest levels, excuses are made for men who harm women. And we saw that with the Ray Rice thing. Excuses were made for that. Let me ask you a question. If Ray Rice had knocked his coach out and dragged him out unconscious from that elevator, we wouldn't even be talking about him. He'd be in jail.
Yeah, when you bring up those facts, one of the things that I kind of wanted to jump in, to make sure we discussed was, silence can literally be deadly, right? And these kids are taught you better not say anything. If you say something, they're going to break up our family and you're responsible. Whatever happens in this household stays in this household. And it's that mentality. And we only promote the see something, say something attitude when it comes to street crime or the possibility of someone, launching some sort of terrorist attack. But we know that the terrorism, right, the impact of this type of violence on children and in the home is real. What do we do in situations where maybe we know someone who's in this predicament and doesn't want to talk to us, or goes ahead and even shares with us but says, I don't really want anything done? What's some advice that we can give these folks? What are some of the things that we should do to empower them to reach out for help? Or, you as someone who has this information, what should you do with it?
Before I begin that, we often think of domestic violence as, well, that's not our problem. I'm not the one being hit. Right? It's not, it's not in my household. But as we've, touched upon in this conversation, it affects the community as a whole. We see that the children are being affected, and in turn that affects their daily lives, their, education, their socialization, etc. So it's not just that's their problem. Let me not worry about it. It becomes all of our a problem, because it does affect us all in some way, shape, or form. In regards to what can we do, if someone, for example, calls us, and we have this, happen on a daily basis in our office as well. They'll say, perhaps one of our members or former, current client will come and say, I have this person who's going through this situation, and she doesn't want to leave, or she's afraid to leave. It's really arming them with the information and the resources, as I said before. It's whenever you are feeling threatened, he or she does not have to lay a hand on you for you to feel threatened, or for you to have, be able to call the police. If anything, that he may say, and sometimes it's just that. It will be, I've heard clients tell me that their spouse has told them, I will send you back to your country in a body bag. If that's not an immediate threat, so you don't have to wait for the person to lay a hand on you. You know, you feel threatened, call the police. They will not report you to immigration if you do not have status and if that's one of the concerns. You know, also, you know, there are these wonderful agencies that can assist you in court. If you need orders of protection, this is what the order of protection does. Perhaps discuss a safety plan, you know, get these documentations, have them ready, have them on hand. And you know, you arm them with enough information. Unfortunately, we can't make that decision for them. So I think that the best thing to do is definitely giving them all those resources available so that they can make an informed decision and know that they will be protected in doing so.
Anthony, you know, along the same lines, how do you assist someone who refuses to seek that help, or you know, is not willing to come out just yet? And you know, what are some of the things that, you know, what would you say to a father, for example, who has talked to his daughter numerous times, or a mother that has talked to, you know, her granddaughter or her grandson and said, listen, you got to get out of that situation, and the child refuses? What do we say to these folks?
Well, we're talking about children who are adults.
Yes.
I've had those conversations with family members many times. I thank them for their compassion and their caring, and I let them know not to give up, and always let that person, their loved one, know that they are there for them. You cannot make a decision for another adult. You can, you know, we give them the number of the domestic violence hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If it's okay, if you're in Nassau County or Long Island, you can call our hotline, 516-542-0404, even if you're a family member, just to get help and assistance. But one thing, you know, Serge, you brought up earlier the children. And in New York State, a child growing up in a home where there's domestic violence is considered a child who's neglected, who's maltreated or abused. And teachers and other professionals, doctors as well, and many other professionals are mandated to report that abuse. But I will tell you, sadly, the numbers are that only about 50% of the cases that should be called into Child Protective ever get called in. So we appeal to, and we train schools, but I appeal right now to anyone who's a mandated reporter, any teacher. If you suspect that a child's growing up in this environment, you need to call Child Protective Services right away. They can help, and they can intervene, and they can go to that home and make a safety assessment and come up with a plan, as Gaby talked about, and refer them to a domestic violence agency. And unless those cases come to us, we can't help. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that Child Protective call is the only way that a professional is going to be able to take a look at what's going on in that family, to assist that mother who's a victim, and to help those children dig out of the situation that they're in.
Anthony, when, you know, I mean, clearly you're talking about mandated reporters, and you know, as two social workers, happy Social Work Month to all the social workers out there doing some great stuff. You know, we're mandated, and you know, so as a result, a lot of individuals say, "Oh, to go talk to the social worker." Mandated reporters are mandated reporters, but not only am I encouraging anyone who comes into contact with young people, I am encouraging anyone who's listening to this to jump on a website, whether it's Safe Center, whether it's SEPA Mujer, whether it's, you know, the National Domestic Violence Hotlines and all these different resources. We have to arm ourselves with this information because we know how many people are being impacted by this. Not only that, you never know when you're going to need it. You never know. You better have the information and be prepared than not have it and need it. And it takes that one time, because you never know. You know, an individual that's reaching out to you for help right at this particular moment may be at the crossroads where time is of the essence. And so you need to prepare yourselves, and you don't think about these things until you're prepping for a story. I think that I'm very informed on a number of different issues. Every time I come and I'm focusing on an issue for the show, you know, and I mean, this to me is alarming. I'm a father of two girls, right? I've said it over and over again. Strong, beautiful girls that are gonna someday need to have this info. I need to have it, even though they're 6 years old and 4 months old. I need to have this information. My partner has it. She shares it with me. We then in turn share it with uncles and aunts and nephews and nieces, because they too need that information. And we share it with religious leaders and people in our travels. We are, getting the word out. And that's really what this show is about, right? Behind the News Long Island, we're talking about the Safe Center. So if you're on Long Island, you need to know what the Safe Center is. And the Safe Center was, formerly, tell us a little bit about that history, Anthony.
Yeah, the Safe Center was two separate agencies. It was the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which also dealt with sexual assault and rape, and the Coalition Against Child Abuse and Neglect in Nassau County. And we had existed separately for about 30 years. Our work overlapped. And our executive directors had been talking for a while about how there was so much overlap with our cases that it was, so important for the families and individuals that we serve that we came together. 5 years ago, we moved into space together. But a year ago, we merged into one entity. And I'll tell you, the first week that we moved in together into a building together, we were doing an intake with a mother whose 13-year-old daughter was sexually abused by the mother's live-in boyfriend. And during that interview with that mother, the mother broke down and talked about how he also was emotionally and physically abusing her, the mother. And we were able to take her and walk her down the hall to talk to a domestic violence counselor. And I will tell you, that happens way more than we had thought it would. So it's so important for agencies to come together, and even if you're not physically located, to work together and to share this information.
That cross-fertilization is extremely important, that collaborative effort. Long Island being so fragmented, Gabby, can you tell us about the difficulties and challenges we have in Long Island, not only based upon region, but also even from a cultural perspective, cultural competence, and above that, and the importance of an organization like SEPA?
Sure. So, SEPA Mujer, we work all around Long Island. Mostly our legal work is based now in Suffolk County because of grants. But our overall work is a lot of advocacy and community organizing and leadership development of Latina immigrants on Long Island. And one area that we've really encountered a lot of challenges in is the East End of Long Island. Excuse me. And so we're talking, the Hamptons and whatnot. And over there we have, these fragmented police departments. So even getting the resources to call the police is extremely difficult for our clients. Where do I go? I don't know where the precinct is. They don't speak Spanish, so we have language barriers. And if they go even into the court, they will not understand what's being explained to them. They don't know where to go. A lot of the women out there are perhaps agricultural workers. So we're talking about women that work and live on farms, which becomes even more of a challenge for them to seek resources. So one of the things that SEPA has established is going out to that region, having monthly meetings with the members out there and giving them the information and resources to do the outreach. To help us keep the women out there informed, to let them know this organization exists and we will provide you with the necessary information that you need to get the help, which is very important across Long Island. I mean, it's so geographically complex. The women are already isolated. You add in the physical limitations and it becomes even more of a challenge for them. So that's one of the goals that we hope to achieve.
Folks, we're winding down here. Anthony, I'd like you to leave our young men that are listening, men of all ages that may be listening right now. Can you leave them with a particular message of a challenge, if you will?
Yeah, the challenge to men is to have conversations among themselves, among ourselves, about what true strength really is about and where power comes from. It comes from respecting yourself, and it comes from respecting others. And violence, domination, power, and control are not examples of that. And a message to the community as a whole, the broader community, is to not tolerate these behaviors. Nobody would think twice about walking up to somebody who is smoking in a restaurant and saying, hey, put that cigarette out. But when we see domestic violence and abuse happen, all of a sudden, we got to mind our own business. We can't. And I don't want people to get in the middle, obviously, of a physical altercation, but call the police, step in if you can, but don't just ignore it. People need that support, and we as a community have to turn it around.
Thank you, Anthony. Gabby, a closing message to our sisters out there.
Sure. Talk about it. Talk about it. Don't keep it, to yourselves. Talk to your friends. Let them know that this is not appropriate, that this is not healthy relationships. And let's start talking to our babies when they are babies, to let them know what it is that we need to demand and expect from relationships as we grow.
Ladies and gentlemen, this program has really evoked something in me. Thank you to my panelists. I have to tell you, this is what this radio station is all about. WBAI is bringing you real talk, real discussions. Thank you so much, Reggie Johnson, for holding down our boards. Picture this. Antonio Kelly for putting this on the internet. Follow us, Facebook, Instagram, Behind the News LI. If you have a program idea, Behind the News LI at Gmail, one word. Remember, brothers and sisters, one mic, one voice. It's not your community. It's not my community. It's our community. And if we don't take care of it, who will? Long Island stand up. Peace.
Check. Hey, yo, it's time. Hey, yo, it's time. It's time. Hey, yo, it's time. We interrupt your programming and bring it to you live from the front lines. Strong animated gangs fleeing one time. Police is brutal like the streets is. Let my speech increase the peace through your speakers. Speak. Our weakness, of course, is division. Caused by religion, race, poor, be in prison way more than the rich ones. The laws of the pawns for position. My flow expose flaws in the system. Look, you can't afford to be a bystander. Behind the news, where the lies die, we strive for high standards. The real power's in the hands of the people. Politics, propaganda, it's all see-through, and that's words.